we're going to be looking at cybercrime, specifically focusing on the dark web's impact in Southeast Asia. Our main source material will be a 2020 UNODC report on exactly that topic. Now, the dark web might sound like something out of like a spy movie or something, but its effects in Southeast Asia are very real and growing all the time. We're going to uncover some really surprising facts about the connection between COVID-19 and this hidden online world. And you might be shocked by some of the stuff that's happening on the dark web, maybe even in your own country. But before we get to all that, let's talk about what the dark web actually is. What comes to mind when you hear that term?
Well, that's a great question. The dark web often gets lumped in with the deep web, but they're not really the same thing. The deep web is essentially the part of the internet that's not indexed by search engines. So think things like your online banking portal or private databases. It's huge and contains a lot of sensitive information. The dark web, on the other hand, is a smaller subset of the deep web. Yeah. And it requires special software like Tor to access.
So it's deliberately hidden. That makes it sound even more intriguing.
Exactly. That anonymity is precisely what draws in both legitimate users and those with less than noble intentions.
Like a digital speakeasy.
I like that analogy. And the report actually shows that a significant number of people in Southeast Asia are using the Tor network, with huge spikes in users back in 2013 and 2018. And a pretty steady climb ever since 2017.
Wow, those are some big numbers. I got to admit, before this report, I didn't realize how widespread the dark web was in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, it's more prevalent than many people realize. And while it's tough to pin down exactly what every user is doing, what we do know from the UNODC report and from various law enforcement investigations is that cybercriminals are definitely active on the dark web in Southeast Asia.
Okay, so what are they doing on there?
Well, one of the more unsettling aspects is the rise of illicit marketplaces. And these operate much like any e-commerce site you'd find on the regular internet.
You mean they have customer reviews and things like that?
Oh, they really do. They even have escrow services to supposedly protect buyers and sellers during transactions.
Wow. It's disturbing to think that illegal activities can be carried out with that level of organization.
It is. And that's one of the things that makes these marketplaces so dangerous. They use systems that people are familiar with, which can create this false sense of security.
The report also mentions cryptocurrencies as a key factor in all this. I understand Bitcoin is a popular way to make transactions on the dark web, but the report also mentioned Monero. What's the difference?
Well, both Bitcoin and Monero offer a degree of anonymity, but Monero goes a step further. While Bitcoin transactions can be traced with some effort, Monero is designed to be virtually untraceable. It mixes transactions automatically, making it much harder for law enforcement to follow the money.
So even more hidden than Bitcoin. What I find fascinating is the report points to a lack of focus on dark web cybercrime in Southeast Asia. Isn't that a huge concern?
Absolutely. It's highlighted as a key finding in the report. There's just not enough consistent data collection. And that leads to policy gaps and a lack of resources dedicated to combating this complex problem. I mean, some might argue that the threat of dark web cybercrime is overblown, but I think the potential consequences for both individuals and businesses are too great to ignore.
So what kind of criminal activities are we talking about specifically? The report mentions some shocking cases that really highlight the dark side of the dark web.
Yeah, that's a good place to pick up after a short break. When we come back, we'll delve into some specific examples of criminal activity on the dark web in Southeast Asia and discuss just how serious a problem this really is.
So we were just talking about how Southeast Asia hasn't been giving dark web cybercrime enough attention. It's a growing problem, but a lot of countries in the region seem to be lagging behind in their response.
Yeah, definitely. It's referred to as a patchwork response
in
the UNODC report, which I think is a pretty accurate description. Some countries are starting to take it seriously. But there's a real lack of consistency and coordination across the region.
Yeah, that's pretty concerning. What are some of the challenges they're facing in trying to combat this kind of thing?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is just a lack of knowledge and resources.
Right.
You know, investigating cybercrime, especially on the dark web, requires a very specific skill set. And a lot of law enforcement agencies just don't have the trained personnel or technology to do it effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds incredibly difficult to track these criminals down,
Yeah.
especially when they're using cryptocurrencies like Monero.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why capacity building within law enforcement is so important. You need officers who understand how cryptocurrency transactions work and the technology behind the dark web and the tactics these criminals use.
The report also highlights a need for greater international collaboration. Why is that so important in this fight?
Well, because criminals don't respect borders. They operate across multiple jurisdictions, making it extremely difficult for any one country to effectively investigate and prosecute them. Southeast Asian nations really need to work together to tackle this.
So what would that look like?
Well, the report recommends creating a regional counter-dark web cybercrime strategy. Imagine like a framework that allows countries in the region to share intelligence and coordinate investigations and pool resources.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Are there any examples of this working?
Yeah, there are actually. The European Union, for example, has made significant strides in tackling cybercrime, and that's through cross-border collaboration and information sharing.
So Southeast Asian nations could follow that model.
Exactly, and adapt it to their specific context. And it's not just about regional collaboration either. Partnerships with international organizations like Interpol and UNODC are also really important because they have the expertise and the global reach to play a crucial role.
Before we move on, I wanted to touch on something you mentioned earlier about how there are legitimate reasons for using the dark web. I think that's really important to highlight.
Oh, definitely. The dark web isn't inherently good or bad. It's just a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for positive and negative purposes.
Dude, what are some of the positive ways it's being used?
But one of the most significant benefits is the anonymity it provides. And this can be a lifeline for people living under repressive regimes where they don't have freedom of speech. The dark web allows them to communicate securely and access information that might be censored and to organize without fear of reprisal.
Wow, that's a perspective I hadn't really considered before.
Yeah, it's important to remember that technology is often a double-edged sword. So we need to be mindful of both its potential benefits and risks.
Speaking of risks, you mentioned earlier that we'd be diving into some specific cases of criminal activity on the dark web in South Asia. What are some of the examples highlighted in the report?
Well, one that comes to mind involved a Canadian citizen running the Alphabet marketplace from Thailand. This was one of the largest dark web marketplaces in the world at the time, and it took a massive international effort to shut it down.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that. Wasn't it involved in drug trafficking and other serious crimes?
Yes, all kinds of illegal goods and services were being traded on Alphabet.
Yeah.
Drugs, weapons, stolen data, even counterfeit documents.
It's crazy how big some of these operations are. Are there any other cases that stand out?
The report also goes into detail about the rise of child sexual exploitation material on the dark web. They talk about cases like Peter Scully, who was running a live streaming service from the Philippines, and Richard Huckle, who abused children in Malaysia and shared images of his crimes online. These cases are just a horrible reminder of how dark the dark web can be.
Those are really horrific crimes, and they really highlight the urgent need for a coordinated response to protect people.
Absolutely. And, these are just the tip of the iceberg. They really underscore how devastating this kind of cybercrime can be.
So it's obviously a complex issue with far-reaching consequences. We've talked about the need for resources and training for law enforcement and regional and international collaboration. But what about us? What can regular people do to protect themselves from these threats?
That's a great question, and something we should definitely talk about more after a short break.
Before the break, we were talking about some pretty disturbing cases of criminal activity, and it's clear that the dark web can be a dangerous place. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about how people can protect themselves. I mean, it can all feel kind of overwhelming with how fast technology changes.
You're right, it definitely can. But even small steps can make a big difference when it comes to your online security.
So what's like the most important thing to keep in mind?
I'd say awareness is key. Just being aware of the potential risks out there is a good first step. Like, for example, understanding how phishing scams work and recognizing suspicious links. And being careful about what information you share online can really reduce your vulnerability.
Right. It's like locking your doors and windows. Basic precautions can make a big difference.
Exactly. And just like you wouldn't leave your front door wide open, you shouldn't leave your online accounts vulnerable either. Use strong, unique passwords for each of your accounts. That's super important. I know it's tempting to use the same one for everything. But if one account is compromised, then they all are.
That's a good point. Password managers can be helpful for keeping track of all those different passwords. What else can people do?
Keeping your software updated is also crucial. Updates often include security patches that fix vulnerabilities that hackers could exploit. So make sure your operating system, your antivirus software, all your applications are up to date.
Like getting regular checkups for your computer. Might seem like a hassle, but it can prevent bigger problems.
Right, and always be careful about what you click on and what you download. Don't click links from people you don't know, and only download files from sources you trust. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Those are all great tips. But what if, despite our best efforts, something does happen? What should someone do if they think they've been a victim of cybercrime?
The most important thing is don't panic,
Mhm.
and don't be afraid to report it. Contact the authorities, your local police, or cybercrime unit. I know it might seem like an inconvenience, but reporting these incidents helps law enforcement track criminal activity and identify trends and develop strategies to combat it.
So even small incidents can contribute to the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're all in this together. Cybercrime is a global problem, and it requires a global effort.
Well, this has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive. We explored the dark web, uncovered cybercrime in Southeast Asia, and learned some ways to protect ourselves.
And remember, this is an ongoing conversation. The digital world is constantly evolving, and so are the threats. So we all need to stay informed and adapt to new challenges.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your insights with us today. And to our listeners, we hope you found this deep dive informative and empowering. Remember, knowledge is power, and by understanding the risks, we can better protect ourselves. Join us next week as we take a deep dive into another fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious and stay safe online in